co-editor of critical studies in risk and disaster with the University of Pennsylvania Press with Kim Fortune. And now Professor Knowles is completing 2 new books. The first one is The United States of Disaster, and the second one is A Slow Disaster. And today's his lecture's title is Death, Life, and Longing in the Pandemicene. Now I will hand over the mic to Professor Knowles. Please welcome Professor Knowles.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jaewon, for that very kind introduction. Let me make sure everything's working here. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? All right, great. Thank you all for being here today for this very exciting convening. Dr. David Kruppen is kneeling over a sedated polar bear. The expanse of the Arctic tundra and a small team of scientists surround him. Underweight, he finally says sadly, probably tried to swim off island and had to come back. Not enough ice, replies his colleague. The long pause that follows establishes the mood. It's a classic opening for a climate fiction, cli-fi thriller, and we know from the start it's not going to end well for the humans, or for the bear, or for the ice. The team's indigenous guide breaks the reverie, yelling from over the next ridge, and the camera zooms in from overhead. A woolly mammoth tusk protrudes from the thawing ice. The biological action driving the Val Kilmer film The Thaw, which came out in 2009, is not the defrosting mammoth. The real find on the tundra is something no one wants. The mammoth is only a host, home to a reanimated horde of insect-like creatures, suspended in place for millennia and now free to prey on any mammals they can find. The Thaw is not a great film, but it is a relevant film. Even reviewers who panned it had to admit that it bore an important message about the planetary changes we now associate with the Anthropocene. The Thaw was in production when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 4th Assessment Report was released, and among the strongest evidence leading its authors to judge climate system warming as what they called unequivocal was Arctic snow and ice melting. According to the report, satellite data, they said since 1978, show that annual average Arctic sea ice extent had shrunk by 2.7% per decade. Mountain with larger decreases in summer, 7.4% per decade. Mountain glaciers and snow cover on average had declined by that point in both hemispheres. The maximum, a real extent of seasonally frozen ground, had decreased by 7% in the northern hemisphere since 1900, they concluded, with decreases in spring up to 15%. Temperatures at the top of the permafrost layer had increased since the 1980s by up to 3 degrees Celsius. At the same time, paleobiologist Natalia Rybczynski, on an expedition in Arctic Ellesmere Island, discovered what turned out to be a bone from a 9-foot-tall ancestor of the modern camel. This finding and others like it, locating an ancient ecosystem of beavers, bears, frogs, fish, hares, and fossilized larch trees, revealed that perhaps 3 to 4 million years ago, the Arctic was no barren wasteland. It was teeming with life. Rybczynski's exciting observations were drawn from fossils, stone, inert, dead things. But what about life in the ice? In 2014, Chantal Abergel and Jean-Michel Claverie introduced permafrost samples gathered in Russia to amoeba in their lab and quickly found them infected. The dead permafrost held a secret, a never-before-discovered so-called giant virus called a pithovirus. 60% of its gene content does not resemble anything on Earth, Abergel told the New York Times ominously about the mysterious unfrozen virus. The story noted that, quote, she and her colleagues suspect the pithoviruses may be parasitic survivors of life forms that were very common early in the history of life. The thawed virus, the Times assured its jumpy readers, is not a threat to humans. But if the new study holds up to scrutiny, it raises the possibility that disease-causing viruses may also be lurking in the permafrost. Such is everyday life in the Anthropocene. This is our time. In the words of the Anthropocene Working Group, the present geological time interval in which many conditions and processes on Earth are profoundly altered by human impact. This impact has intensified significantly since the onset of industrialization, taking us out of the Earth system state typical of the Holocene epoch that postdates the last glaciation. Melting Arctic ice with attendant sea level rise, habitat loss, animal migrations, mass extinctions, each process is by now a well-documented Anthropocenic reality. Less obvious before SARS-CoV-2 simultaneously changed all of our lives were the ways that the Anthropocene might also give rise to an epidemiological analog, epitomized by accelerating rates of zoonotic spillover, with disease pathogens flowing from species to species. In 2022, Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist Ed Yong, who has defined the COVID pandemic with his crisp insights into both the science of disease and the socio-political impact of the pandemic, coined a term to capture the phenomena. I'm quoting Yong here. The Anthropocene, an era defined by humanity's power over Earth, he said, is also an era defined by viruses' power over us. A pandemicene. For the world's viruses, this is a time of unprecedented opportunity. I take Ed Yong's article as a provocation for my talk today. This time of planetary viral opportunity, as Yong put it, has been opened by the same human actions that drive Earth system changes, like those we heard about yesterday from Julia Thomas and Simon Turner. In my brief time, I'd like to explore two contexts, maybe call them markers, of the pandemicene. First, zoonotic spillover. Second, a viral technological symbiosis, or what I will call the pandemic infodemic convergence. STS scholars can never resist coming up with some fancy phrases for things. Pandemic infodemic convergence, I'll explain more in a minute. Both of these are social phenomena, globally dispersed and leaving plenty of evidence. And like so much sociability in the Anthropocene, the exchanges involve many species, not just humans. And in fact, these exchanges, paging Donna Haraway, draw humans and machines into shared lives too. More on these ideas in a bit. The great Anthropocenic thaw is rewriting evolutionary history. Natalia Rybczynski's discovery of the mega-camel bone on Ellesmere Island gives one example. The humps on a modern camel's back, long associated with adaptation to hot climates, is likely a much older anatomical feature evolved for fat storage in long northern winters, before Ice Age migrations found the camel shrinking and heading south and west. The ice also contains organic mass, some of it pathogenic, and that's not just cli-fi. To date, dozens of new viruses have been discovered in glacial ice, added to the pithovirus discovered in 2014. Now, how might such viruses get to animals and humans? In our minds, or at least in my mind, such places are empty. But of course they aren't. In 2016, a child and his grandmother died in an anthrax outbreak connected to melting permafrost in Arctic Salakard, Russia. Localized cases of thaw-related infections are rare for now, but as reanimated viruses and bacteria surface, they will certainly join their local ecosystems, including animals like reindeer or rats or bats and birds, who can take them literally anywhere on Earth. Ultimately, The Thaw is a disaster movie, more about human hubris than it is about Arctic science. But science fiction and science fact are always in a dance. At a crucial point in the film, Krupin's daughter, Evelyn, realizes that the only way to avoid a global infestation of the rapidly multiplying parasites is a quarantine. If a parasite can kill a polar bear and a mammoth, it can make quick work of a human. Most of the team have already died horribly. I'm not ruining the film for you, I promise. You're still going to enjoy it. To save the world, no one can leave the Arctic Research Station. For audiences, this plot point might have brought to mind the 2003 SARS pandemic or the 2007-8 Ebola outbreak, both cases of zoonosis where disease spilled over from non-human animals to humans, and governments suddenly exercised extraordinary quarantine powers. Today, it's impossible to hear Evelyn's hopeful plea for quarantine in the name of human survival and not think about the 6,895,277 dead around the world from SARS-CoV-2. We have to contact disease control. They'll know what to do better than us, Evelyn pleads with her colleagues. Spoiler alert, unfrozen prehistoric parasites are survivors. On his poultry farm in the outskirts of Hong Kong, it was normal for Wang Yichan to find about 10 dead chickens per day. But on a December morning in 2009, he discovered 200. What made the find extra alarming was that many of the dead birds were sentinel chickens called Xiaobengji, purposefully excluded from mandatory vaccinations against H5N1 influenza to serve as an early warning system against disease outbreaks among the flock. Anthropologist Frederick Keck describes the scenario firsthand in his really wonderful 2020 book, Avian Reservoirs, Virus Hunters and Bird Watchers in Chinese Sentinel Posts. The sentinel birds warn about novel disease outbreaks among a species, but they also warn of the possibility for a zoonotic spillover from birds to humans. Following bird flu outbreaks in the region in 2003, the government installed the Sentinel program. Unvaccinated chickens were placed at the ends of rows of cages. Staff of the Agriculture, Food, and Conservation Department of the government visited farms every week to check that vaccinated chickens were immune and that Sentinel chickens were pathogen-free. The largest study to model zoonosis in the Anthropocene appeared this year in the journal Nature. Produced by Colin Carlson and Gregory Albery, as well as colleagues, the study brings trends like climate-driven animal migration and new densities of diverse animal populations into one model. The authors predict that the vast majority of mammal species will overlap with at least one unfamiliar species somewhere in their potential future range, regardless of emissions scenarios. This may not look like a lot of new animal interactions at first glance, but it's important to keep scale in mind. The model predicts 6,500 mammal species will be in motion due to climate change in the coming century. This means, according to the authors, quote, a minimum of at least about 15,000 cross-species transmission events of at least one new virus, but potentially many more, they put that in parentheses, between a pair of naive host species. In the next decade alone, they write, it could cost at least $1 billion to comprehensively identify and counteract zoonotic threats before they spread from wildlife reservoirs into human populations. The rapid movement of species and their viromes poses an unexpected challenge, the authors conclude. The raccoon dog next to Tucker Carlson it's the small details you got to watch for. The earliest theory and still the consensus view among qualified investigators is that the origins of SARS-CoV-2 centered on the Huanan seafood wholesale market in Wuhan, China. It was here where a likely zoonotic spillover from animals to humans took place. A retrospective 2022 report in Nature, based on the most extensive scientific reviews of the zoonosis theory to date, found that most people infected with COVID-19 at that time had been there at the Huanan market in the days before they began to show symptoms or were in contact with people who had been. Hoping to stem the outbreak, the authorities closed the market. Researchers then collected samples from poultry, snakes, badgers, giant salamanders, Siamese crocodiles, and other animals that were sold there. They also swabbed drains, cages, toilets, and vendors' stalls in search of the pathogen. Following an investigation led by the World Health Organization, researchers released a report in March of 2021 showing that around 1,000 environmental samples from the stalls and other areas of the market were positive for COVID-19. The zoonosis explanation gained momentum, I would argue, in no small part because of the ambient public knowledge of pandemic history. The deep historical resonance of the Black Death and its rats, actually marmots, as it turns out, has power. So do more recent, more anthropocenic spillovers of disease from one species to another and another. From Ebola to bird flu, swine flu to anthrax, people intuitively seem to grasp the Wuhan wet market origin story for COVID. But not everyone. In May of 2020, the COVID origin story saga took a new turn with the release of a film called Pandemic. This tense 26-minute documentary constructs a COVID origin story that taps into a wide variety of existing conspiracy theories and weaves them into one tight braid of paranoia. With scientist Judy Mikovits at the center of the story, presented as a victim of a cabal of science industry gatekeepers, we learned that Anthony Fauci, this is in the film, we learned that Anthony Fauci is working hand in hand with big pharma vaccine manufacturers and with the Wuhan Institute of Virology to force the world into submission. The frame is still zoonosis, but in Mikovits' telling, SARS-CoV-2 was crafted in the lab on purpose to grant power to Fauci, create need for a vaccine, and enrich all of the companies and scientists on the take. I don't have time here this morning to unpack the entire lab leak hypothesis for you, but there remains a strong interest among many that the virus was manufactured in the lab and released into the population with or without intention. The Sydney Morning Herald yesterday reported that the lab leak theory is dead. It went out with a whimper, they said. But I know that American conspiracy promoters will never accept this view. In Pandemic, there's only one innuendo. There's only innuendo, no evidence, but Pandemic met its moment, circulating rapidly with millions of downloads in the United States and around the world, and featured by big audience conspiracy-loving podcast hosts like Alex Jones and Joe Rogan. Also in the spring of 2020, another group calling itself America's Frontline Doctors began calling into question the official scientific consensus not only around the origins of COVID, but also its infectiousness, death rate, and possible therapies. America's Frontline Doctors promoted the use of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, neither yet tested in clinical trials for COVID efficacy. And before long, both Donald Trump and Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro were touting the drugs too, leading to hoarding and shortages among people who actually did need them to treat diseases like lupus. The pandemic was now intertwined with an infodemic, a term first presented by health communications scholar Gunther Eisenbachen in a 2002 paper to describe disturbing trends of health misinformation and calculated disinformation circulating with greater speed and reach via internet usage, the infodemic. Here we find the pandemic-infodemic convergence I mentioned before. Perhaps this is predicted by Peter Haff's concept of the technosphere, where the technological system of rapid communications we rely upon for information, for life, also transmits messages that wreak havoc and death. Research on the pandemic-infodemic convergence can put social scientists in a bit of a bind, especially scholars who are actively working to document corporate and governmental malfeasance in environmental and health policy. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, for example, have amply documented merchants of doubt in the tobacco and petrochemical industries and their effective efforts to befuddle the normal workings of science in order to confuse the public and forestall government regulation. Conspiracies do exist, and please, if you're filming me, don't take that out of context, what I just said. Conspiracies do exist, and in the heat of an emerging health disaster, it's easy for people to give up on the task of chasing good information and just to turn to someone who can give them a clear answer. And there's a lot of social science about behavior and disaster that shows us that. At some point, people will seek a clear, definitive declaration of what they need to do in a disaster rather than seeking more information from experts they've never met. Even if it's not an evidence-based answer, people want it. The pandemic to infodemic spillover is cultural, minds meeting minds over shared fears that there is more to the story than the experts are telling us. Complicated graph, sorry. Let me just read the caption. Interactions, this is from the New York Times. Interactions, so this is basically, this is a graph of interactions with various viral online phenomena, according to the New York Times, within the first post, 1 week after and 2 weeks after. So we see Sorry, Swifties, but Taylor Swift's City of Love down the bottom. The Office reunion, pretty good. Pentagon aerial phenomena, that must be a Q thing. I don't even know that one. And then look at Pandemic, the number of shares within 2 weeks. Within a week of its release in early May of 2020, the Pandemic video was viewed 8 million times across Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. Compiling raw numbers like this is impressive, but the harder work is tracking the way that conspiracy documents like Pandemic actually move from person to person in the infodemic. To do this, scholars are using new data analysis tools to identify the online gatekeepers, many of them operating in the shadows with anonymous social media accounts, who know how to reach their audience and set the pace for the successful spread of a conspiracy campaign. Indeed, such campaigns aimed at internet users in the United States have been traced back to Russia in the months leading up to the 2020 election, 2016 election. With lives and health hanging in the balance, the infodemic might, in this sense, be seen as a type of bioterrorism. Kate Starbird, disinformation specialist at the University of Washington, who's now being harassed by the U.S. House of Representatives to give up all of her data, has tracked the COVID infodemic since early 2020. With colleagues at the Center for an Informed Public, she's been connecting the intertwined phenomena of the infodemic and right-wing violence, including the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. In a February 2021 COVID Calls episode with the barricades still up in Washington, Starbird explained to me the viral pathway from COVID to terrorism. This is Starbird. Step back and think about that Pandemic video, she said, and how it spread all of these conspiracy theories. It comes out in May. It begins to connect anti-vaccine communities with the QAnon communities, and then hyper-partisan right-wing media took that content and spread it out to sort of a larger pro-Trump audience. They and these communities began to develop connections between them over time and become networked and close, an ecosystem, more closely networked to spread misinformation. The producer of the Pandemic video, Starbird told me, was on the Capitol grounds on January 6th. One of America's frontline doctors was arrested for being inside the Capitol building on January 6th. And so we have to think about the disinformation system around COVID-19. It's politically motivated. False narratives of election fraud became the grievance-based motivation for what we saw on January 6th, establishing a connection between COVID and terrorism. Starbird works with forensic data tools, tracking innuendo, lies, conspiracy, misinformation, and disinformation as it moves across social media platforms. In a real sense, Kate Starbird became an infodemic sentinel in the pandemic, discovering infection not in chicken cages, but on Facebook and on Twitter. On June 2nd, 2020, I was conducting a live COVID Calls interview with 3 scientists from the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University, getting their take on biodiversity and the pandemic. In many ways, this is how I coped with the pandemic, talking to disaster experts who told me terrible and worrying things every single day, but somehow it was a relief to talk to people who cared. Per normal, for over 2 months at that point, I was sitting in my upstairs office in Princeton, New Jersey, a very privileged spot for a non-essential worker, talking on a microphone to guests separated by great distances across state lines, broadcasting via YouTube and Twitter to anyone in the world who wanted to watch. My window was open. The trees outside were lush. I turned to ornithologist Jason Weckstein. One of the things people have pointed out in this tragic, very strange time in which we find ourselves, I said, is the surprising emergence of biodiversity all around them. Jason agreed, and then he paused for a second, and he said, "I heard a bird out your window, Scott. I heard a downy woodpecker calling." He's listening to me from Pennsylvania, but he heard the woodpecker outside my door. I've returned to this moment time and again as a beautiful example of the close interplay among people, animals, and technology in the COVID-19 pandemic. Weckstein makes his life studying birds, so identifying the call of the downy woodpecker might not be so surprising. But the fact that it was quiet enough for him to hear the woodpecker calling from somewhere on my street in New Jersey through a microphone and into his ears somewhere in suburban Philadelphia was a rare sonic condition indeed. Had I been living in the UK in those months, I might very well have been inclined to join the Self-Isolating Bird Club. I would have joined an online group launched by naturalists Chris Packham and Megan McCubbin that grew to include over 50,000 people. Club members found each other on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube and shared wildlife images and videos. Their activities were the antithesis of the infodemic. It was a digital therapeutic community that spanned species barriers. Anthropologists Jonathan Turnbull, Adam Searle, and Jamie Lorimer got busy documenting the activities of the Bird Club and the motivations of its members and have published truly extraordinary findings. I can't recommend these papers enough. In one instance, an SIBC member, a Bird Club member named Abigail, revealed the ways that interacting with wildlife brought calm in a scary time. For Abigail, the authors note, the pandemic was a time of trauma, fear, and anxiety, but nature offered a total distraction from everything that was going on. For her, it was absolutely crucial that the first lockdown started in spring. The serendipity of lockdown beginning as nature was coming into blossom was a significant consolation for many quarantined people slowed down just as nature was speeding up. Today, I struggle to imagine the future impacts of COVID. But this talk, I hope, shows that we will surely know this pandemic as more than just mortality counts. It is an Anthropocenic phenomenon, intertwined and provoked by the same forces that are reshaping the planet with stunning speed. COVID is our clearest demonstration yet of the Pandemicene condition, zoonotic spillover in a warming world, a novel disease running rampant, syndemics, that is, pandemics intertwined like racial violence and viral outbreaks, the infodemic, the convergence of the infodemic and the pandemic, and we're really just at the beginning of understanding. Hundreds of thousands of children around the world are right now growing up having lost one or both parents to COVID, and the disease lingers in many of those whom it does not kill. Long COVID is the umbrella term used to denote a huge array of various post-disease syndromes related to COVID. Long COVID sufferers are finally receiving some measure of recognition. Their struggles do not comport nicely to the simple model of a disaster that ends when emergency management officials tell us the disaster is over. The largest study of long COVID phenomena to date was published last year, and it arrives at some startling conclusions. Between 6 and 18 months following symptomatic SARS-CoV-2, almost half of those infected reported no or incomplete recovery. Half, almost. Symptomatic SARS-CoV-2 infection was associated with a wide range of persistent symptoms: impaired daily activities, reduced health-related quality of life, independent of socio-demographic factors, and pre-existing health conditions. So it complicates our social models of disease. The strongest associations were observed for symptoms potentially cardiovascular in origin: breathlessness, chest pain, and palpitations, as well as confusion. Trouble breathing, confusion, a disease that lingers. Long COVID is more than just a physical condition. The pace is slow, the suffering long. In COVID times, in the Pandemicene, we get our clearest idea yet of what it will mean to live in slow disaster, a long process of trauma interspersed with bursts of mass death. Okay, I want to conclude not on that last note. When Julia gave her talk yesterday, she started with a very bleak opening, and then she turned to quite a hopeful interpretation of possible work we might do together. So I don't want to end on this sort of negative note. I want to conclude with an activist's message, a hopeful message based on the work for disaster justice we can see around the world, led by survivors and bereaved families. Their work is sometimes done in the courts, sometimes in the court of public opinion, in the media, but also in efforts to create memorials, museums, and sites of learning that capture the history and tell the truth about disasters and their impacts. Memorialization is not what happens when a disaster is over. Memorialization is what happens when disaster victims demand intergenerational justice. Memorialization is a tool to work for disaster justice in the Pandemicene. It takes history seriously as a tool for enlightenment and for political action. COVID memorialization is today a global effort. Many of you are probably engaged in this work already. This sometimes takes the form of large-scale mass movements, exemplified by the work of Kristen Urquiza and the Marked by COVID organization in the United States, the largest victim-centered and bereaved family-centered advocacy group for COVID in the United States. It can also take the form of artistic efforts, like Heather Schulte's remarkable Stitching the Situation project. So from the left here, we see one slide from the Marked by COVID Facebook page. I do encourage you to check out Marked by COVID and their work trying to get a COVID Memorial Day, as well as the many things that they've published, what they call honest obituaries, actually telling the truth of why people died in COVID, not just glossing over that part. The Stitching the Situation is a collaborative textile project. Brings people together to memorialize loved ones killed by COVID. In the collaborative moments, people come together literally and stitch images of dead loved ones. People organize. They refuse to forget or to accept a deadly new normal. This is what activism for the Anthropocene actually looks like. It's the glimpse of hope and a different future I'd like to close with today, and I look forward to further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Knowles, for your enlightening talk. And I would like to open the floor to questions now. So just is there anyone who would like to ask questions?
No question.
Yeah, if not, just just using my privilege as moderator, I ask one question. So
The microphone.
yeah. So, but I really enjoyed your talk, and in fact, I was one of the how can I say, the person just appeared on your COVID calls, and you talked about the importance of the memorization of a COVID disaster. And I'm curious, what do you think? What kind of role of your podcast, COVID calls, played in the making of the memorization of the COVID disaster? Did you make sense?
I don't think there's any way to assess what kind of impact COVID calls had. I mean, any measures we try to use to understand, social media phenomena, you just end up with numbers of clicks and things like that. It doesn't really tell you much about what ideas really work. I mean, even that pandemic video chart I showed maybe gives pandemic a little more credit than it deserves. But what I was hoping to do early in the pandemic, most of the discussions I had on COVID calls were with disaster researchers, like people like myself who already identify as working in this space. But by the summer of 2020, when even I, who should have known better, realized that this was not going to end quickly, I started to find that there were already memorialization efforts underway. And so what I really wanted to do was hear from those people. And I knew that they were under tremendous political pressure. You can go back and look, even in the summer of 2020, people who were pushing memorial efforts at that time were already being attacked. How can you say we should memorialize it? It's not even over. I mean, there are many different strategies of sort of trying to deplatform memorializers. It's probably because politicians understand that the word memorial, which I think a lot of times people think is a kind of soft word, it's politics. And so a memorial is a form of structured remembering. And if you want to remember COVID in a structured way, you will use whatever methods you can to do that. And it takes many different forms. So I was lucky enough to, one of the interesting things about the COVID time is when you would ask people to talk with you, they tended to say yes much more than they do now. I guess people were home. And my first interview along these lines was with Kristen Urquiza, the founder of Marked by COVID. And it was a transformative conversation for me. And we've talked many times since then. I don't think I did anything other than offer one more platform. Maybe retrospectively, we look at the archive and say, oh, there's some patterns here. But I did it in a purely selfish way, because I was worried that COVID, even while it was in its worst moments, was already being forgotten. And I think history, our recent history, already shows that to be true.
Thank you. So,
Hannah?
yeah, please.
Thank you for your inspiring talk. I'm Hyuna Kim, studying as a doctoral student in the Graduate School of Science, Technology, and Policy. And I have it might be a short question. I can see the COVID memorialization can be very distinctive in a sense that it's not really ended. COVID is still with us, but I also see the climate change. I mean, some similarities in climate change. It's still with us, and climate crisis is getting aggravated. So can you share if there is any wisdom to not, I don't want to like flattenize the comparisons between COVID and climate crisis, but can you share any wisdom for better climate change, climate crisis memorialization from the lessons from the COVID memorialization? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really, I really like that question, to think across different disasters. That act alone will immediately break us out of the kind of unfortunately normal thinking about disasters as discrete events that have a beginning and a middle and an end, and it should be understood according to mostly made up categories, like some are natural and some are technological, as if they aren't all really united by the way they affect people. I think that the COVID memorials show the power of social media. I mean, this is the sort of two ways of thinking about this infodemic, right? I mean, the infodemic is a spread of information. Some of it can be quite harmful, and some of it potentially can be quite sustaining. I mean, that's the way technology works, right? It's neither not all good or all bad. The climate memorials that I'm aware of right now are ones like the almost like marking receding glaciers. There's a climate memorial in Iceland that marks the recession of a glacier. There's a project that was proposed in the United States, believe it or not, but never funded by the Congress, to create a climate chronograph in Washington, D.C., where you could watch over time as water eventually inundated a grove of trees, and so that people could actually go there year after year and see the process happening. Those are very experiential. They're not very digital. And so maybe one of the things that climate change activists who are interested in the power of memorialization, drawing us all into a conversation around loss and creating a new platform for solidarity, I think that's what memorials can do. Their efforts could be much more digitally informed. And I think we've seen that with COVID, because by necessity, COVID memorials had to thrive in an environment which was full of misinformation and conspiracy, but also putting out messages of hope and solidarity. And maybe some of you are aware of climate memorials that already do that. I think there's also, interestingly, a lot of interconnection. So Kristen Urquiza, who I mentioned before, began her career as an environmental activist. I think there's a lot of interconnection here among memorial communities. I think it's completely appropriate to mourn for COVID and to mourn for the impacts of climate change simultaneously, and even to think about memorials which are simultaneous. And some people might say, well, that's getting too confusing. Shouldn't memorials be about one thing? Well, no, not if the memorial is fundamentally about injustice. Thank you, Hyuna.
Yep.
Only hard questions come from this guy.
I'm not planted for the questions. It's going to be a hard question because this is a environmental history conference. I want to ask you about the historical dimension of your story, and also environmental aspects of your story. And then I'm asking this because when the pandemic COVID-19 started, a lot of people are talking about the past pandemics like SARS and 1919, the influenza, and then going all the way back to plague, and then your story is quite current and more future oriented and activism. And so but how you kind of without, talking about the past cases, like a comparative understanding, but how you sort of talking about the historical things and then also environmental things.
So, I mean, one of the ideas provoked by that question is whether or not there's a golden spike for the Pandemicene, or should we be looking for moments of inflection when when spillover, for example, or pandemic, so disease moving around the world, when that becomes sort of more prominent, or when it becomes much more connected with human activities which are related to the Anthropocene. I think that I can't tell you a date, but I would tell you, and this comes back to our opening plenary yesterday, part of the challenge might be to actually look more for markers, Pandemicene markers, in the more distant past. I mean, I mentioned yesterday Monica Green's work, in which she's trying to reconceptualize how the Black Death actually worked using ancient DNA technology. So she's working with geneticists. And she's found some really remarkable things about that there were multiple points of zoonosis, and that there were disease reservoirs that existed in Africa and Central Asia and what we call the Middle East for long periods of time. So it was not, most of us learned about the Black Death. It came from somewhere we don't know in the East and made its way to Europe where it mattered. And that's the story she's trying to push back on. And that's a form of infodemic moving at a slower pace through textbooks over 200 years. So I'm inspired by that kind of work that might seek to locate it further in the past. I guess I'm not as invested in the golden spike, but I am invested in the sort of process of historical investigation that might look for these complicated interplays between human and non-human actors across space and time that lead to pandemics.
So time is up, and I believe that everyone is quite hungry, including myself. So I think that we have to stop here. So thank you for being with us, and just please give a big applause to the Professor Scott Knowles.